In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a virtual height field mesh to add displacement to your landscape textures in Unreal Engine 5. So I'll start with making a new landscape. I'm going to activate landscape editing mode, and I'll just keep the default values here and hit create. And I want to add a few hills here, so I'm just going to paint, I'm going to lower my brush size and paint some random hills around here. All right, so I'm going to go back to select mode, and I've already prepared a basic landscape material, and I'll show you the material. If you've done any work with landscapes in Unreal Engine, this should all look pretty familiar to you. This is very basic. I have a sand layer here and a grass layer here, and both of those come into a layer blend node. And so you could have, 10 different layers here and all kinds of advanced material functions feeding into here and whatnot. For this example, I'm only using the 2 layers, and really you're editing after the layer blend, so it doesn't matter, how advanced your material might be. You're going to prepare this the same way to use the virtual height field mesh. And so what I'm going to do here is drag off after the layer blend here. I'm going to break the material attributes. Then I'm going to right click here and get a runtime virtual texture output node. And I will connect up the base color and the roughness and the normal. And now I also need to plug in some world height information. And so with my textures here, I've got the displacement maps plugged into the world displacement nodes. So when I break the material attributes from the layer blend, I can get the displacement from the world displacement node and multiply that by some amount that we want to displace by and plug that into world height. But I also need to add the height of the actual landscape mesh itself in the same position. So the way we do that is I'm going to right click and type in world position. And this will give me the absolute world position of the landscape mesh where this texture is being applied. But I need to mask this result. I actually only need the height values, the Z values. And the way I can do that is drag here and type in channel mask parameter. And you can call this really anything. I'm going to call this mask. And we need to set the mask channel to blue. And blue will give us just the Z values, the height values of this absolute world position. So now I can go ahead and drag from here and make an addition node. And now I want to add the world displacement from our textures, and I'm going to multiply that. And we'll drag back off of the B node here, and I'll type scalar and select scalar parameter. And I'll call this displacement amount. And I'm going to set this default value to 50 to start with. All right, so I'll plug this result here into the addition node. And the total result into the world height node for the virtual texture output. Okay, so that's it. That's basically how you arrange your landscape material to work with a virtual height field mesh. Now we need to do a handful of other steps to prepare. I'm going to save and close this. And what I'll do first here is actually draw a bit of this texture onto the landscape. So I'll select my landscape actor, and I'm going to make an instance of this landscape master material. And I'll drag that here to the landscape material. And we'll have to do some painting in landscape mode. So I'll select paint mode and build these layers, I have to create the layer info here. And this is all pretty basic stuff you should be familiar with if you've done anything with landscapes. So it's not the focus of this tutorial. I'm just going to go ahead and blast through this. And right away, I'm going to just paint some grass on top of these hills. Okay. So I can see that I need to change the tiling parameter. This is all looking really large for the size of landscape. So I will go back to selection mode here. And I'll open the instance for this material and adjust these numbers here. Let's try 0.1. Well, that looks a lot better. I'm going to try that for the sand as well. Okay. So it seems like a realistic scale. Obviously a lot of tiling going on here, but not too worried about that right now. So I'll close this and let's take a look real quick here. So this looks okay, and depending on the angle that you're looking at, or where the lighting is at, it's somewhat convincing. But if you put the camera right to the ground, you can see that it's actually really flat. These puddles are just drawn on. There's no actual depth here at all. And worse yet, if you look at the rocks here, it looks really bad because they're not really rocks. It's actually just paint on a texture, and it's not convincing at all. So that's where we need to add displacement. So in Unreal Engine 4, typically we would just plug in our world displacement here with some sort of multiplier, and this would displace our actual landscape mesh. And we relied on tessellation to add polys where the camera is looking in order to have enough detail so that the displacement created a convincing detail. The landscape by itself has not nearly enough vertices to create the kind of detail we need, and so we needed something like tessellation to achieve that. Now in Unreal Engine 5, tessellation is deprecated, it's been removed, and the only way to achieve that effect on the landscape is to use the virtual height field mesh. And to use that, we have to actually go to Edit and Plugins, and I'm just going to search here for virtual height field mesh, and I need to enable this plugin. So it's going to say I need to restart the editor, and I'm not going to do that just yet because we need to do one more thing. The virtual height field mesh relies on virtual textures, so I need to go to Project Settings and search for virtual, and I'm going to find Enable Virtual Texture Support, and check that. And now I'm going to go ahead and restart the editor, and everything should be ready to go. Okay, so I'm back in the editor here, and I'm ready to set up the virtual height field mesh. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create a runtime virtual texture target. So I'm going to right click here and find Materials and Textures and select Runtime Virtual Texture. I'm going to call this RVT_world height. And I'm going to open this, and I need to select under Virtual Texture Content, I want to change this to world height. Save and close. And now I need to add a runtime virtual texture volume to our scene. So I'm going to go to Create and Volumes, and I'm going to drag in a runtime virtual texture volume. And I'm going to go to the Details panel, and under Virtual Texture, I'll select the RVT world height target that we just made. And I want to make this volume encompass the entire landscape area. So there's a function you can use in the details panel here. It's called transform from bounds. And I can select bounds align actor and select, say, the landscape here and set bounds. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work exactly right. So in this case, it's just given me this area around here, not the entire landscape. So you can either, increase that to encompass the whole thing, or maybe you only want to use this in a smaller spot or one particular part of your landscape. One thing that I've noticed is it's helpful to have this volume start out a little bit lower than the landscape and have a height that's a little bit higher than the landscape. So I'm going to go ahead and change the Z location here to 0. And I'm going to change the height to 1000. Okay, so now this center part of the landscape is firmly enclosed by this volume. And I'm just going to go ahead and rename this volume up here. Click on this to RVT underscore world height. And now I'm going to go ahead and select my landscape actor. And in the details panel, I'm going to scroll down and find virtual texture. And draw in virtual textures, I need to add to this array one element and select RVT world height. And so this is drawing a height map of our landscape to that RVT world height texture target. And you can see the height map here in the thumbnail. These gray circles here are these hills that we have in the middle. And the virtual height mesh actor that we're about to add is going to use this height map basically to overlay another mesh on top of this mesh, but that mesh is going to have the height data that we want and a lot of polys, and you can control how many polys, and we'll get to that in a minute. So I'm going to go to create, and I'm just going to go to all classes and hover over the list here. I'm going to type in height field, and I'll drag this into the scene, virtual height field mesh. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is go to the details panel, and under height field, I'll select a virtual texture and find RVT world height. And again, I can use this copy bounds feature to make the size of this volume the size of the RVT world height volume. And now I need to build the height field, and this is basically an automatic process. I can just click here on build, and it's going to offer me a save name for this texture. I'll just accept the default, and it'll take a second here to build. Okay, and that's done, and we can see the results of that texture in the thumbnail here. And by default, this virtual height field mesh is hidden in the editor. But if I wanted to see it, I can scroll down here in the details and uncheck actor hidden in editor. And there it is. Now we can see that the mesh is there, but it doesn't have any color material. It's got the default world grid material, and that's because the virtual height field mesh actually requires its own material to be assigned, and unfortunately I can't just drop on the landscape material that we have underneath. We don't get any throughput because it's from the material, but it's not getting the rendering information that it needs because it's not a landscape layer. It has no layer info. So what we have to do instead is we're going to remove this material, and we have to make another volume, virtual texture volume. Just going to select Actor Hidden in Editor again, and I'm going to select my world height volume that we already made, and I'm going to press Ctrl W to duplicate that. And I'll click to rename, and I'm going to call this one RVT_texture. All right, now for this one, I need to make a new target, so I'm going to right click and go to Materials and Textures, click on Runtime Virtual Texture, and I'm going to call this RVT_texture. Okay, so in this RVT texture volume, I'm going to find virtual texture in the details panel and select RVT texture. And now I need to select the landscape actor and go to the virtual texture section and add one more element to this draw in virtual textures array and select RVT texture. Okay, and right away in the thumbnail we can see we're getting the color information into this texture. So now what we need to do is make a material that we'll apply to our virtual height field mesh. So I'll right click and make a new material, and I'm going to call this one height field mesh _matte. And I'll open that up, and for this material I need to right click and get a runtime virtual texture sample node. And then in the details panel here, we're going to indicate which virtual texture we want to sample. So we need to find that RVT texture. And then I'm going to pipe the base color and roughness and normal information to the result node. And that's it. We can save and close. And now I'm going to select the virtual height field mesh and drag this material onto it here in the details panel. And now we should be able to enable view in editor and see the texture applied. And we can. So right away you can see the major difference when we apply displacement here. Let's get a bit closer. All right, we can see those rocks that before had no definition at all now are essentially rendered in 3D. And this might be a little bit too much displacement. You can play with the displacement amount, obviously, to get something that works best for your scene. So basically that's it. This is the virtual height mesh in place. And so I'll play around with it a little here. Okay, so I'll just hit play and walk around a bit here. And yeah, it looks great. One thing I'm noticing here right away is my character's feet are sometimes clipping into the displaced texture. Or in this case, for example, hovering a little bit over that puddle. Which is to be expected because the virtual height field mesh, it's just exactly that. It's virtual. It's displacing this texture on the screen, but this layer doesn't actually have any collision. So you're really just walking on the layer below, and see, in a lot of cases, for example, if I walk into this rock, I can clip my entire ankle into the rock, and it just doesn't look great. Kind of breaks the illusion. Looks like I'm hovering there a bit. So as good as this may look, as much sort of free detail as you can add from just displacing your texture, you can overdo it for sure, or you may not want to use it or use it as much in a scene where in areas where characters are actually walking. If it's maybe a different kind of scene, a cinematic, you know, with a flyby, or it's an out of bounds area where it's there for the, you know, for the look of it, but nobody can actually go there, then, you know, this is great. It works out fine. I'm going to take a look here at some of the settings that we can play with in terms of the LODs on that mesh. And so I'll just click on the virtual height field mesh, and I'm going to select wireframe mode here. And so we can see our relatively dense height field mesh. And let's see here, we've got LOD 0 screen size. Okay, target screen size for an LOD 0 tile. So let's see if I play with this, if I make this 2, we get fewer polygons for the screen size. 3, okay, so it's getting, you know, the polygons are getting much larger as you move away in the view. Up close here, there's a lot. In the mid-range, there's a medium amount, and further away, there's quite a few less. I'll change this back to 1, and that's much more dense. Distance scale, a larger value increases the distance to the versed LOD transition. So these areas here where it's going to transition to the next size, you can adjust, you know, how far it should go between those, just like that. I'm going to set that back to 1. And LOD distribution, multiplier applied for each LOD level. So I think the default here was 2. Right, 1 is quite a bit lower, not enough. You can see it's almost the same as the resolution of the blue landscape wireframe underneath. 1.5 adds a little bit. 2 adds a lot. You know, we could go up from here, even 2.5, looking really dense now. So you can control the kind of the cost you want to have in terms of the displacement by changing these LOD values here to, you know, whatever you like. Go back to lit here, and so I turned up the LODs really high, and you can see we have pretty good definition on these rocks. They almost look like foliage scatter, or actual 3D models that we've added that you would typically, you know, scatter around a scene. So, you know, this is looking really great, and certainly has some great applications depending on what you're doing with it. All right, so that's it for this video. Hope that you enjoyed, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions.